It's Friday, July 24th, 2026, and at 6:45 in the evening Eastern Time last night, United States Central Command began the 13th consecutive night of airstrikes against the Islamic Republic of Iran. 13 nights. Not 13 days of tension, not 13 days of warnings. 13 consecutive nights of American aircraft going into Iranian airspace and taking apart the machinery of a country that decided it could put a toll booth on 25% of the world's seaborne oil. The CENTCOM statement was almost clinical in how little it said. Military command centers, drone storage facilities, communication networks, coastal surveillance sites, maritime capabilities. 5 categories, no target counts, no locations, no elaboration. And that restraint in the language is itself the message, because when a military stops bothering to explain what it hit, it usually means the hitting has become routine. Now here is the number that should stop you cold. On the same day that 13th night of strikes was announced, oil crossed $100 a barrel for the first time since May. Not because of the strikes, because Yemen's Houthi rebels attacked Saudi shipping in the Red Sea, which means the second escape route, the alternative corridor that the entire global energy market was quietly relying on while Hormuz burned, just started closing too. 2 choke points, 1 squeeze. And every person watching this who has filled a gas tank in the last 2 weeks already felt the first tremor of what that means. But let's back all the way up, because to understand what just happened, you need to understand what has been building. This did not start last night. It did not start last week. It started on February 28th of this year, when the United States and Israel launched joint airstrikes across Iranian military, government, and infrastructure targets. And in the course of that opening campaign, Iran's supreme leader was killed. Let that register for a second, because the entire rest of this story runs downstream from it. A theocratic state built for nearly 5 decades around a single supreme religious authority lost that authority in the opening hours of a war. Everything Iran has done since has been the behavior of a system trying to prove it still has a spine while the head is being reattached in public. Iran's answer was the one lever it has always known it possessed. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps put out warnings over VHF radio to every vessel in the waterway, stating flatly that no ship was permitted to pass. The British Royal Navy pointed out, correctly, that a unilateral closure has no basis in international law, but also that nobody could guarantee anyone's safety, and that second half is the only half that shipping companies actually care about. Vessels stayed in port. Vessels turned around. Insurance underwriters started pricing transits like they were pricing a coin flip. And a waterway that carries roughly 1/4 of the world's seaborne oil trade and about 1/5 of global liquefied natural gas seized up. And you have to understand the geography to understand why this works, because the Strait of Hormuz is not a strait in the way most people picture one. At its narrowest, it is roughly 21 nautical miles across, and the actual shipping lanes inside it, the inbound and outbound traffic separation scheme that every vessel is required to follow, are about 2 miles wide, each with a 2-mile buffer between them. 2 miles. That is the operating width of the artery, carrying 1/4 of the world's seaborne crude. And every inch of that lane sits inside the range envelope of coastal artillery, shore-launched anti-ship missiles, fast attack craft, and now drones launched from positions a few minutes of flight time away on the Iranian side. There is no maneuvering room. There is no evasive routing. A 300,000-ton, very large crude carrier moving through that lane at 12 knots has the turning radius of a small city and the defensive capability of a parking garage. It is the single, most target-rich, defense-poor stretch of water on the planet, and Iran has spent 40 years building a military doctrine around that exact fact. That is the part most people missed entirely. Iran did not need to sink a single supertanker to do enormous economic damage. It only needed to make the possibility of sinking one credible enough that the market did the work for them. That is what asymmetric maritime warfare actually is. It is not a navy. It is a threat distributed cheaply across a very narrow piece of water. And the Iranians did not stop at threats. Over the following months, the IRGC boarded and attacked merchant ships, laid naval mines across the strait, and eventually escalated to anti-ship ballistic missiles fired from mobile coastal batteries. By the current accounting of the crisis, at least 17 merchant ships have been damaged, 7 of them abandoned by their crews, 2 vessels have been outright captured, a tugboat has been sunk, and 12 seafarers have been killed or are missing. Those 12 are not soldiers. They are merchant mariners. Filipino, Indian, Ukrainian, Greek, Bangladeshi crew members working $200 a day contracts on ships that had nothing to do with anyone's foreign policy. The United States responded on April 13th with a full naval blockade of Iranian ports, and the numbers from that first blockade period tell you exactly how effective a modern blockade is when you have the assets to enforce it. 85 vessels intercepted, 3 ships seized, an estimated cost to Iran of $500 million per day, according to American figures. 26 vessels managed to slip through per Lloyd's List reporting, which is a real gap, but a gap of 26 out of that volume is not a leak, it's a rounding error. Iran retaliated by seizing 2 cargo ships of its own, which is precisely the sort of gesture a state makes when it needs to be seen doing something and has run out of things it can actually do. That first blockade lifted on May 29th. Diplomacy took over. In June, delegations from Washington and Tehran sat down and negotiated toward a war-ending framework, and both countries signed a memorandum of understanding. For a few weeks, the world exhaled. Shipping volumes began to recover. Since early May, CENTCOM has helped facilitate the transit of approximately 900 commercial vessels, carrying about 450 million barrels of crude oil through that corridor. And that figure is the single best measure of what the American military presence in that water is actually accomplishing. And then it fell apart. Because that is what agreements do when one side signs them as a tactical pause rather than a settlement. Now let's talk about what happened at the end of June, because that is the sequence that broke the ceasefire and set up everything you're watching right now. Iran launched 4 attack drones at a Singapore-flagged commercial vessel operating near the southern approaches off Oman. Then another ship was struck the following morning. The United States announced it was expanding the southern Omani corridor, the safe transit lane that allows vessels to move in and out of the choke point. And the Joint Maritime Information Center confirmed the corridor was being widened to permit simultaneous inbound and outbound traffic. The UK Maritime Trade Operations Organization, which is the body that actually sets threat assessments for commercial shipping in that water, raised the threat level to substantial. On June 26th, 6 land-based American aircraft executed precision strikes against Iranian missile and drone storage locations and coastal radar sites at Sirik, Jask, Minab, Keshem Island, and Bandar Abbas. Those are not random dots on a map. Every one of those is a node in Iran's coastal kill chain along the northern shore of the strait. And Keshem Island in particular is considered part of what one researcher memorably called Iran's arch defense, the layered ring of islands and coastal positions that lets the IRGC reach out and touch anything in the waterway. CENTCOM called it a powerful response and released the strike footage publicly. Iran's foreign ministry accused the United States of violating international law. And then the IRGC did what the IRGC always does, which is issue a statement that reveals far more than it intends to. Here is what they said. The consequences of traveling on unauthorized routes will be the responsibility of the owner, operator, and commander of the vessel. Read that again. Because that is not a warning. That is a published targeting doctrine. A warning tells you that a place is dangerous. This tells you who Iran holds accountable when it makes the place dangerous. It relocates the moral and legal responsibility for an Iranian missile onto the captain of the ship the missile hits. It defines an entire international waterway as a system of authorized and unauthorized routes, with the IRGC as the authority that authorizes them. And embedded in that sentence is the entire commercial architecture of what Iran has been attempting to build for 5 months. Unauthorized route is not a safety category. It is a billing category. It is the language of a protection racket written in the grammar of a maritime safety notice, and the Qatam Al-Anbiya Central Headquarters made that explicit back in May when it declared that all ships, commercial vessels, and oil tankers were exclusively required to transit designated routes and obtain permission from the IRGC Navy. Permission from a Navy to use an international strait. That is the demand underneath every drone, every mine, and every anti-ship missile in this campaign. And the material puts a number on why. Iran stands to gain in the neighborhood of $90 billion a year if it can successfully institutionalize control over transit through that waterway. Now, that figure should be treated as an estimate rather than an audited ledger, and the important point is not the precision of the number, but what it would mean if it is even approximately right. $90 billion a year is not a grievance, it is a business model. It is larger than the entire declared Iranian defense budget by an enormous multiple. It is the difference between a sanctioned, blockaded, economically strangled state and a solvent one, which means every analyst framing this as a religious conflict or an ideological confrontation is looking at the wrong instrument panel entirely. This is a revenue operation with a theological press office. The morning after those June strikes, Iran launched drones at Bahrain, not a random target. Bahrain hosts the headquarters of the United States Navy's 5th Fleet, the command element that runs American warships across the entire region. The drones were engaged and destroyed. Aegis destroyers, F-16s, layered air defense, the whole architecture doing exactly what it was designed to do. But the selection of that target matters more than the outcome. Because Iran was not trying to destroy 5th Fleet headquarters, it was trying to prove it could reach for it. And here is where it gets significantly worse. The IRGC's official statement on that Bahrain launch described it as retaliation for the warmongering U.S. regime that attacked several points in Jask and Keshem under false pretext. The pretext being that Iran had been striking commercial vessels in an international waterway for the purpose of extorting transit fees from the global shipping industry. That is the pretext being described as false, and the vice president's response cut through all of it in about 20 words. Iran signed a ceasefire agreement. We have honored it. If they have disagreements about how the MOU is being applied, they can pick up the phone, but violence will be met with violence. That last clause is the entire American policy in 6 words, and it explains the 13 consecutive nights you are watching right now. Now let's talk about what actually flies these missions, because the strike package structure tells you more about American intent than any press release ever will. When CENTCOM says coastal radar sites and coastal surveillance sites, and then confirms a strike, you're looking at a suppression of enemy air defenses mission. And that means the F-16 Block 50 and 52 Wild Weasel was almost certainly in that package. This is not a general-purpose fighter doing a general-purpose job. This variant exists specifically to hunt radar. It carries the AGM-88 HARM, the high-speed anti-radiation missile, a weapon that homes directly on radar emissions. The physics of that are brutally simple and brutally elegant. If your radar is off, you cannot see the incoming aircraft. If your radar is on, the missile can see you. There is no third option. The Wild Weasel mission forces every Iranian radar operator along that coastline into a decision that has no correct answer, and it forces them into it repeatedly, night after night, until the operators themselves start hesitating before they flip a switch. Understand what those pilots are actually doing. They go in first, ahead of the strike aircraft, into contested airspace deliberately as bait to see what turns on. That is the job description. Fly into the threat envelope and invite somebody to shoot at you so that the package behind you can work. And the cumulative psychological effect of 13 straight nights of that is not measured in destroyed radar dishes. It is measured in the degradation of an air defense network's willingness to function at all. Behind the Weasels comes the freight. The F-15E Strike Eagle, a 2-seat aircraft with a weapons systems officer in the back specifically because the targeting workload on a deep strike against hardened structures exceeds what one person can manage. Against missile and drone storage facilities, many of which Iran has built into underground and semi-buried positions along the coastline, you need mass and penetration. 2,000-pound precision-guided munitions, bunker-penetrating weapons in the 5,000-pound class for structures dug deep enough to survive anything lighter. The Strike Eagle has been the workhorse of this entire campaign, and it has not been free. American aircraft have been lost. Crews have been shot down and recovered. This is not a video game where the blue side has invulnerability turned on. And then there is the naval layer, which is the part that almost never makes the coverage, but is arguably doing the heaviest lifting. The EA-18G Growler providing electronic attack and jamming, FA-18s off the carrier decks, and the guided missile destroyers holding the Omani corridor open with Aegis combat systems running a layered intercept architecture. SM-3 interceptors for ballistic missile threats, standard missiles for cruise missiles and aircraft. And at the innermost layer, when everything else has failed and something is seconds from impact, the Phalanx close-in weapon system, a radar-guided rotary cannon that fires thousands of rounds a minute at inbound drones and fast attack craft. That is what is standing between a Panamanian-flagged product tanker with 22 crew aboard and an Iranian anti-ship missile. 4 layers of interception, running 24 hours a day for months. And the choice of platform is itself a message, which is the part that gets lost in every piece of coverage that treats military hardware as trivia. When CENTCOM names coastal surveillance sites in its target list on night after night after night, it is telling Tehran something very specific. It is saying we are not trying to destroy your navy. We are trying to blind it. A ship you cannot see is a ship you cannot target. And a coastal radar network that has been struck on 11 of the last 13 nights stops being a sensor grid and starts being a collection of expensive holes in the ground. The same logic applies to the communications networks that appeared on last night's list. You do not strike communications because you want to silence propaganda. You strike communications because you want the battery commander in Sirik and the battery commander in Jask to stop being able to talk to each other and to stop being able to reach the headquarters that would tell them not to fire. The Growler deserves more attention than it gets because electronic attack is the least visible and arguably the most decisive element of the entire package. It does not blow anything up. It floods the electromagnetic spectrum with noise and deception until an Iranian radar operator is looking at a screen full of aircraft that are not there and missing the 2 that are. Combine that with the harm threat, and you have created a situation where turning the radar on produces garbage data and a missile, and leaving it off produces nothing at all. That is not degradation of an air defense system. That is the removal of its reason to exist. On the naval side, the Aegis architecture is doing something that has genuinely never been done at this scale in combat. It is running continuous multi-domain interception over a fixed corridor for months against ballistic threats, cruise missile threats, drone threats, and small boat threats simultaneously, while escorting commercial traffic through the middle of it. Every intercept is a decision made in seconds by a combat system and confirmed by a human being in a darkened compartment who will never be named in any news report. 900 vessels have gone through that corridor since early May. The overwhelming majority of the people aboard them will never know how close anything came. Now here are the operational numbers as of today, and these are the ones that matter. 13 consecutive nights of American strikes as of last night. Over the past 3 months, according to CENTCOM, Iran has attacked more than 30 commercial vessels transiting that waterway. On July 11th alone, in the third round of strikes in a single week, American forces hit approximately 140 Iranian military targets. Since the naval blockade was reimposed 9 days before yesterday's statement, CENTCOM has redirected 12 commercial vessels and disabled one to prevent traffic entering or leaving Iranian ports. Approximately 900 commercial vessels and 450 million barrels of crude have transited under American escort since early May. Nearly 100 American service members have been assessed with some degree of injury since July the 7th, the overwhelming majority minor concussions from missile attacks on regional bases, with about 96% already returned to duty. 4 American service members have been killed in recent days, and oil closed above $100 a barrel yesterday for the first time since May. Every one of those numbers is a pressure gauge, and right now every single one of them is climbing. The escalation ladder over the past 2 weeks reads like a case study in how ceasefires die. On July 11th, the IRGC attacked a Cyprus-flagged container ship, and 1 crew member went missing. Iran's account was that it fired a warning shot at a vessel attempting an unauthorized route, and then it declared the strait closed again. On July 13th, the IRGC announced it had struck and disabled what it called 2 rogue supertankers for ignoring warnings and attempting a mined route. That statement came after 2 United Arab Emirates tankers, the Al Bahia and the Mombasa, were hit by Iranian missiles in the southern strait while inside Omani territorial waters. An Indian crew member aboard the Mombasa was killed inside Omani waters, meaning inside the sovereign territory of a country that has spent this entire crisis functioning as the region's designated peacemaker. On July 15th, American forces ran a 90-minute round of strikes on Greater Tumb Island and then completed a second wave the same day against command centers, air defenses, missile and drone capabilities, and coastal surveillance facilities, with Bandar Abbas explicitly named. Air defenses activated over Tehran itself. On July 17th, the IRGC released footage of missiles launching toward American targets in Qatar, Kuwait, and Oman. On July 19th, the 9th consecutive night, the IRGC claimed to have intercepted 4 ships. Kuwait reported repelling missile and drone attacks, Jordan's army reported 3 Iranian missiles falling on its territory, and the United States began moving fighter aircraft stationed in the United Kingdom and Germany into the Middle East. On July the 20th, explosions were reported in Bandar Abbas, Keshem, and the Omani district of Hormozgan province. And then, yesterday, the 23rd, 2 things happened simultaneously that you need to hold in your head at the same time. The 13th night of strikes began at 6:45 p.m. Eastern, and Iran rejected an American ceasefire proposal delivered to Tehran by the Iraqi Prime Minister, with Iranian officials telling reporters that Tehran was not interested in a temporary arrangement that left the question of control over the Strait of Hormuz unresolved. That brings us to the detail that changes everything. Iran did not reject that proposal because the terms were insulting. Iran rejected it because the terms were temporary. Tehran is not negotiating over a ceasefire. Tehran is negotiating over sovereignty of a waterway, and it has now stated publicly that it will not accept any framework that defers that question. Which means the American theory of victory, that sustained military pressure eventually produces a deal, is running directly into an Iranian position that no deal is acceptable unless it settles the one thing Washington will never concede. Both sides have now floated the idea of charging a toll for passage, Iran through the IRGC's authorized road architecture, and the American president, in an interview on July 13th, suggested a 20% toll for safe passage through the strait. Sit with that for a moment. 2 governments, at war with each other, have both independently arrived at the conclusion that whoever controls that water gets to monetize it. The disagreement is no longer about whether the strait should have a landlord. It is about which one. Now let's talk about who is actually giving the orders on the Iranian side, because this is where the real story lives, and almost nobody's covering it properly. For nearly 8 years, the IRGC Navy was commanded by Alireza Tangsiri, who took the post in August 2018 and became the longest-serving commander of that force since the revolution. Tangsiri is the architect of everything you are watching. He was the one who bet, years ahead of consensus, that the next generation of naval warfare would be unmanned, and he invested accordingly in drone swarms, autonomous underwater vehicles, and sea-launched ballistic missiles. He pushed for large-scale prepositioning of stealthy naval mines. He built the layered coastal defense architecture across the islands. And when the war came, all of it deployed at once. drone boats harassing tankers, mines laid from disguised fishing vessels, anti-ship ballistic missiles fired from mobile coastal batteries. In some cases, for the first time in operational history against live shipping, Tangsiri was killed on March 26, 2026, in an Israeli strike on a secure apartment in Bandar Abbas, where he was meeting with other senior naval commanders. Israeli officials described it as the culmination of weeks of intelligence collection. He had been moving between safe houses since the campaign began, but had never stopped directing the blockade personally. The IRGC's naval intelligence chief, Behnam Rezai, was killed in the same operation, along with several other senior figures in the naval command. Iran's armed forces confirmed his death 5 days later. And here is the part that matters. The IRGC Navy did not announce a replacement for more than 3 months. Ali Asmaei was only publicly identified as the new commander in early July, in a statement issued around the funeral ceremonies for the late Supreme Leader, and even then the announcement came almost incidentally rather than as a formal appointment. A former deputy stepping into the chair of a man who had held it for 8 years and built the entire doctrine personally. Now think about what that gap represents. For over 3 months, the force conducting the most consequential maritime campaign in decades was being run without a publicly acknowledged commander, while the Supreme Leader's own succession was still being processed. The nominal chain of command runs through the Khatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters, which is Iran's highest operational military authority and the body that issued the declaration about full authority over the strait. But the actual operational decision-making, the choice to fire on a specific hull on a specific night, sits far lower in that structure with local commanders in Hormozgan province who have watched their leadership decapitated, who know their own shelf life is measured in weeks, and who are being asked to make split-second targeting calls under sustained air attack. That gap between the nominal chain of command and the actual one is the most dangerous feature of this entire situation, and I want to be very clear about why. There are 3 pressure tracks operating on Iran simultaneously right now, and the convergence is the point. The first is financial. The naval blockade is choking export revenue at a rate the American side has previously put at $500 million a day. Karg Island, Iran's primary oil export terminal, and the artery through which its economy breathes, has been directly targeted in the interdiction campaign. 12 vessels redirected and 1 disabled in the last 9 days alone. Every day the blockade holds, the $90 billion prize Iran is fighting for gets further away, while the cost of fighting for it compounds. The second is military. 13 consecutive nights of strikes against command centers, air defense networks, coastal surveillance, communications infrastructure, drone storage, and maritime capabilities. American fighter squadrons redeploying from Europe into the theater. This is not a punitive campaign. Punitive campaigns are short. This is systematic attrition of a specific capability set executed with enough repetition that reconstitution becomes impossible. Iran can rebuild a radar site. Iran cannot rebuild a radar site every night for 2 weeks while under continuous attack. The third is psychological, and it is the one being underestimated. Senior commanders are being killed with precision that implies deep penetration of Iranian communications and command networks. Every general who takes a leadership position in that force now understands he is taking a position with an actuarial expiration date. The willingness to concentrate leadership in one room has evaporated, which degrades coordination, which degrades operational tempo, which pushes decision authority further down the chain to people with less judgment and more to prove. Any one of those tracks alone is survivable. Iran has survived sanctions for decades. Iran has survived air campaigns. Iran has survived leadership decapitation. What Iran has never faced is all 3 at maximum intensity simultaneously, while the supreme leadership itself is in transition. The convergence is producing an effect that none of the individual tracks would produce alone, and that effect is not capitulation. It is unpredictability. So here is the honest strategic assessment, and it is not the story either side is telling. The American campaign is working operationally and failing strategically. Operationally, the numbers are unambiguous. 900 vessels moved, 450 million barrels transited. The corridor is being held open by force, and it is staying open. Iranian strike capacity against shipping is measurably degraded from where it was in March. That is a real military accomplishment executed by real people at real cost, including 4 American lives in recent days and nearly 100 injuries since the 7th of this month. Strategically, however, 13 consecutive nights of the most precise air power on Earth have not moved Tehran's negotiating position 1 inch. Iran rejected the Iraqi-brokered proposal yesterday. Iran's stated condition is resolution of control over the strait, which is the one thing Washington cannot concede without effectively transferring sovereignty over global energy flows to an adversary. There is no overlap between those positions. None. Which means the pressure campaign is not producing a deal, it is producing a stalemate at a much higher level of violence, And the cost of that stalemate is now being paid by the entire world economy through the price of a barrel. And the Houthi attack on Saudi shipping in the Red Sea this week is the development that should worry you most. Because the entire assumption underlying global energy market resilience during this crisis has been that if Hormuz closes, cargo reroutes around the Cape, through the Red Sea, through the alternative pipelines. If the Red Sea becomes untenable simultaneously, that assumption collapses, and a $100 barrel is the market's first small acknowledgement of that possibility rather than its final verdict. Now here is the thing that actually keeps serious people awake, and it is not any of the headline events. It is command fragmentation. When you decapitate a military leadership structure repeatedly and successfully, you do not get a more compliant adversary. You get a more decentralized one. Tangsiri built that force personally and understood exactly where the escalation lines were, because he had spent 8 years calibrating pressure against American response. He knew which tankers to threaten and which to leave alone. He knew that hitting a Chinese-flagged vessel would cost him his only remaining diplomatic patron. That calibration lived in his head, and in the heads of the naval aides who were killed alongside him. The commanders making targeting decisions in Hormozgan tonight do not have 8 years of calibration. They have a new commander appointed 3 weeks ago, a chain of command that has been struck repeatedly, degraded communications networks that were themselves on last night's target list, an enormous internal pressure to demonstrate that the force is still capable of imposing costs. That is the exact profile of an organization that hit something it did not intend to hit. An American warship instead of a merchant, a Chinese tanker instead of a Western one, a cruise ship, a vessel carrying a nationality that turns a regional war into a global one overnight. Nobody in Tehran needs to decide to escalate for the escalation to happen. A 29-year-old missile battery commander in Hormozgan province, operating on degraded targeting data, with no ability to reach anyone above him, only needs to be wrong once. Now let's talk about what nobody in the mainstream conversation is connecting, which is that this is not happening in isolation. While 13 nights of strikes have been running over the Gulf of Oman, Ukraine has been escalating its own deep strike drone campaign against Russian missile production infrastructure, reaching targets that were considered untouchable 18 months ago and forcing Moscow onto its heels in a domain it assumed it dominated. And China has been steadily extending the endurance of its carrier deployments, pushing operational periods longer and longer with each cycle, working the logistics and at-sea replenishment problems that separate a navy that can sortie from a navy that can stay. Neither of those developments is dramatic on its own. A 40-day carrier deployment is not a threat to anyone, but every serious planner in Washington is watching the same thing, which is that American naval and air assets are currently concentrated in one theater, executing a sustained high-tempo campaign, with fighter squadrons being pulled out of the United Kingdom and Germany to feed it. Combat power is finite. Attention is finite. Munitions inventories are very finite. And the entire logic of a choke point strategy is to force an adversary to spend disproportionate resources holding a small piece of ground. That may be the actual Iranian theory of victory. Not to win in the Strait, to make holding the Strait expensive enough and long enough and distracting enough that it costs the United States something somewhere else, which would mean the $90 billion toll booth was never the whole plan. It was the bait for a much longer game. And the mines are the other half of that problem. Naval mines laid across the Strait since March do not report to a chain of command. They do not stand down when a ceasefire is signed. They do not distinguish between an authorized and an unauthorized route. They sit on the seabed, doing exactly one thing, and clearing them is slow, dangerous work that cannot begin at scale until the shooting stops. Which means that even in the best case scenario, even if a deal were signed tomorrow, that waterway carries a lethal legacy that will take many months to clean and will keep insurance rates elevated long after the last aircraft goes home. So let's come back to where we started. 13 consecutive nights, command centers, drone storage facilities, communication networks, coastal surveillance sites, maritime capabilities. A CENTCOM statement that no longer bothers to list target counts because the counting stopped being newsworthy somewhere around night 8. Oil above $100 for the first time since May. An Iranian government that rejected a ceasefire proposal yesterday because it was only temporary. A waterway that carries a quarter of the world's seaborne oil, held open by 4 layers of interception running around the clock, guarded by people whose names you will never learn. And that IRGC sentence, still sitting there, still published, still operative. The consequences of traveling on unauthorized routes will be the responsibility of the owner, operator, and commander of the vessel. They have not withdrawn it. They have not softened it. 13 nights of American air power have not produced a single word of retraction, which tells you that as far as Tehran is concerned, the toll booth is still open. The routes are still authorized or unauthorized at their discretion. And every ship's master transiting that water tonight is still, by Iranian definition, personally responsible for whatever happens to his crew. Somewhere out there right now, a merchant captain is looking at a chart, looking at a corridor and making that calculation. He has a schedule, he has an owner, he has 20-odd people asleep below decks who trusted him with the decision. 14th night is coming. If you want to keep tracking this as it develops, go ahead and subscribe, because this is moving faster than anyone expected, and the next 72 hours matter more than the last 13 days.